Well, thanks for coming out on a stormy late afternoon. My name is Ty Tessitore. I teach in the Department of Politics and International Affairs. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this lecture given by Dr. Kriya Tu. Before introducing the speaker, I want to say just a couple of words about the people who are making this possible. This lecture is sponsored both by the Tocqueville Program and also the Ernest J. Walters Lecture Series in Political Thought. Both of them are housed in the Department of Politics and International Affairs. So, a word on each. The Tocqueville Program is currently in its 9th year, and we seek to contribute to the development of thoughtful citizens by exploring norms, beliefs, opinions, values, which are embedded in politics. The program is supported by a broad coalition of philanthropic organizations and several generous individual donors, including Ginny and Sandy McNeil, Beth and Ravenel Curry, the AWC Family Foundation, and the family of Jane Cage Hip. Our sponsors support the program in the belief that genuine liberal education encourages students to become more thoughtful citizens and more dignified human beings. If you are interested in liberal education, understood as the best that has been said, thought, or written, then the Tocqueville Program is interested in you. Information about the program and how you can become involved is on the desk outside and also on the university website. Just have to search for Tocqueville Program. The Walters Lecture Series was established in 2001 to honor the life and legacy of Professor Walters. Professor Walters dedicated his professional career to Furman University, teaching in the Department of Politics, Political Science as it was then called, for 27 years. After his death in 1997, the members of the department decided there could be no better way to honor his contribution than to continue his legacy by bringing in distinguished political thinkers on a yearly basis. So this memorial lectureship has been established by the students that Professor Walters inspired and the friends and family he cherished. We're pleased to have Terry and Amy Walters here this evening. So before I introduce our speaker, if you could just take this occasion to turn off your cell phones or any other kind of electronic device that could potentially be disruptive, that would be appreciated. So Aurelian Kriya Tu is professor of political science at Indiana University on the Bloomington campus, almost as beautiful as Furman's, but quite beautiful. He has published extensively in the field of modern French political thought, from Montesquieu to Raymond Aron, a 20th century figure. He received his BA in economics from the Academy of Economic Studies in Bucharest, Romania, where he was born and raised, and received his PhD, MA and PhD in political science from Princeton University. In 2000, he won the American Political Science Association's Leo Strauss Award. This award is given, recognizes the best doctoral dissertation written in political theory for that year. Dr. Kriya Tu's many publications include Liberalism Under Siege, The Political Thought of the French Doctrinaires. It was published by Rowman and Littlefield in 2003 and won in 2004 a Outstanding Academic Title Award from Choice. He also published Tocqueville on America After 1840 with Jeremy Jennings, and America Through European Eyes with Jeffrey Isaac, both of which were published by Cambridge University Press in 2009. Professor Creatu has hit his stride. He is currently in the midst of an ambitious, multi-volume research project on the underappreciated tradition of political moderation. He likens this tradition to, and I'm quoting him here, an entire submerged archipelago that has yet to be rediscovered and properly explored. This larger project began to crystallize with a volume he wrote entitled In Praise of Moderation, which was written for a general public and published in the Romanian language. I'll let him give you the Romanian title of that. I won't even try. Since then, he has published A Virtue for Courageous Minds, Moderation in French Political Thought from 1748 to 1830, published by Princeton, and promises another volume from 1830 to 1900. That's on its way. His most recent book, Faces of Moderation, The Art of Balance in an Age of Extremes, was published by University of Pennsylvania Press in 2016. This book has been is getting a lot of notice. It has been favorably reviewed by both the liberal-leaning New York Times and earlier this week by the more conservative Wall Street Journal. I take this to be a good sign and indirect testimony to the virtue of moderation itself, which seeks to engage all sides of the political spectrum. That's a characteristic of the virtue of moderation. And it bodes well for Dr. Creatu's larger project, although one might ask how many books on moderation would be in keeping with the virtue of moderation itself. I actually suspect I know how Professor Creatu would answer that, but I'm going to leave it to you if you want to. All right? But seriously, please join me in welcoming Dr. Creatu, who will speak this evening.
It is a great honor for me to be here with you this afternoon. So first, I'd like to thank you for taking time to be here in this rainy environment. I'd like to thank Professor Tessitor and all of the sponsors who made possible my visit. I was really looking forward. It's a great pleasure to share with you my ideas on moderation, and tomorrow on Tocqueville, who is by far my favorite author. Because Professor Tessitor mentioned the irony about writing about moderation, I will say that I will test the value of my work next week when I have invited to Indiana University Charles Murray, and we'll see how my colleagues and my campus will react to moderation in practice. And I will give you a full report of my visit. I've already started receiving messages from my colleagues and disgruntled students about the visit. So whether or not moderation pays, we'll see next week. I suspect not. I have circulated a handout that I hope you all got. And what I'd like to do today, in a nutshell, is presented on this handout. I'd like to talk about moderation in 6 steps, and they are listed on the handout. On the back, I've taken the liberty of adding some interesting quotes from different people, from Barry Goldwater to David Brooks, Thomas Friedman, and Simone Weil, a very interesting thinker from France. I'd like to start, however, with something that came up in an online discussion on actually the topic of moderation. As Professor Tessitor, my book, Faces of Moderation, has generated some attention, probably because of the Trump elections last year. And the review that it got in New York Times, courtesy of Peter Wiener, generated some interesting responses. And one of them actually provides a good entry into the topic today. This is what a reader of Peter Wiener's review of the book called One Way Not to Be Like Trump, thought about moderation. There is very little evidence, he wrote, to suggest that moderation is part of the American psychology. Listen what he has to say more. In a country where the general philosophy seems to be bigger is better, moderation will be hard to come by. Just take a look at the size of your portion sizes, cars, houses, chicken, and yourselves. I was intrigued by this remark of the reader because it seems to suggest that there is no room for moderation, that moderation is not a virtue, and even if it were a virtue, it would be bad to espouse it in our private lives, maybe, and also in our public lives, especially in our public lives today. And as I was reading this, I was reminded that ever since Machiavelli, the symbols often used to describe successful politicians have been the fox used as an image of shrewdness, and the lion, respected and feared for his force. Machiavelli actually reversed the point made by Cicero in On Duties, a book that I understand students are reading just now. For the Roman thinker, politicians should follow neither the lion nor the fox if they are to maintain a certain standard of morality and honesty in public life. The Florentine thinker, Machiavelli, thought the otherwise. In order to be successful, Machiavelli insisted, politicians must be prepared to imitate both the lion and the fox. Neither the lion nor the fox, Cicero, both the lion and the fox. As a symbol of innocence, however, and meekness and moderation, the lamb makes no appearance in the imaginary of political thinkers. The lamb is never mentioned as a possible model in our public and private life. Why is this so? I've always asked myself. Have we all become Machiavellians, or are we all under Machiavelli's spell? In this lecture, I would like to offer you a few answers to explain this paradox, and I will argue, as Professor Tessitor suggested, that political moderation represents a coherent, complex, and diverse tradition of thought, and indeed what I like to call an archipelago which still awaits to be explored and remains, moreover, vitally important for us today. And I will end in an immoderate way by outlining a few rules for moderates, because I believe that moderates represent a party without banners that might one day be successful in politics. How far that day is from our present situation, unfortunately, is hard to tell. One thing is certain, though, is that we live in a highly polarized political context today in which those who dominate the political headlines, from the politicians who made Brexit possible last year in the United Kingdom to those who elected Donald Trump into the White House, have little faith in or need for moderation. This has to do not only with their personal inclination towards immoderation, but it has to do probably with a certain skepticism towards the virtue of moderation as a whole. And I like to reflect a little bit on this skepticism because I take it to be a serious matter. A few years ago, Rush Limbaugh, an influential American conservative radio host, proclaimed, and this is number 5 on the handout that I circulated. Rush Limbaugh wrote this: by definition, moderates can't be brave. They don't have opinions. Brave moderates, he asked, great moderates in American history, show me that book. His ironic words remind us, I think, that moderation is an inconspicuous virtue prone to understatement. It is difficult, indeed, to be enthusiastic about moderation. A virtue that lacks or seems to lack charisma carries the connotation of small-mindedness and Philistine dullness and promotes what Friedrich Nietzsche once denounced as bland or soft moralism. Moderation has a discreet and sometimes obsolete charm, which is unlikely to appeal to everyone. Moderates are often marginalized, derided, ignored, or simply forgotten, while moderation is often stigmatized, in Edmund Burke's own words, as, quote, the virtue of cowards, and compromise as the prudence of traitors. The skepticism and reluctance to theorize about moderation and think seriously about this virtue has several causes. One of them, as I mentioned earlier, is that moderation has often been understood as a vague virtue, too imprecise to be rigorously analyzed, too vague, too elusive. Its universe appears as fuzzy, defying apodictic and universal statements. With such a topic, one is late to think that we can only deal with nuances of gray, and we know that gray has many shades, maybe 20, maybe 50 shades of gray, and that makes things even more complicated, as you will guess. So we tend to like starker colors, red, brown, green, and so forth. And secondly, in ordinary language, a moderate person carries the connotation of someone incapable of making strong decisions or having strong feelings, someone who is wishy-washy, a flip-flopper. Correspondingly, moderation has sometimes been equated with indecision, docility, and submissiveness, virtues of the meek, to which many in search of more exotic adventures prefer more manlier virtues. Thus defined, moderation has been seen indeed as an incoherent virtue, the opposite of fortitude and decisiveness, and it was regarded by many, still is, as incompatible with firmness and clarity of purpose. That's what we admire in politicians, clarity of purpose and firmness, standing on principles. As a virtue that seems rarely able to bring electoral success these days, moderation seems therefore unable to quench our thirst for greatness and glory, and therefore we consider it to be proper only to shy and tepid individuals allegedly incapable of grandiose actions. Let's consider a few examples if we are to descend for a moment from the temple of theory into the arena of politics. In 1964, Barry Goldwater famously proclaimed in San Francisco at the GOP National Convention before losing big time in the general elections, and this is the first quote on the handout. Extremism in the pursuit of liberty is no vice. Moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. Today's politicians and pundits in America seem to have taken his skepticism towards moderation a notch further, especially in the wake of the passing of the Obamacare 7 years ago, the debt ceiling stalemate in 2011 and 2013, and the failure of the immigration reform in 2013. In the primary elections from 2012, if you may recall, the man who eventually became the Republican presidential candidate, Mitt Romney, worked hard, perhaps too hard, to defend himself against the accusations of being a moderate, a label that has made him unappealing in the eyes of many electors eager to vote at the time for firmer and tougher politicians who stood on principle and whose universe consisted of primary colors and sharp contrasts, not shades of gray. In the recent primaries last year, Ted Cruz mocked the three previous moderate GOP presidential nominees, Bob Dole, John McCain, and Mitt Romney, and suggested that they lost because they were all moderates, lacking a strong and viable vision for the country. The retirement from the Senate of several moderates, by my count, 2 Republicans and 4 Democrats last year, was a clear sign, I think, of the little faith that we seem to have in this virtue today. One of them was Senator Olympia Snowe, a Republican senator from Maine, that played a key role in the passing of the stimulus package proposed by the Obama administration in 2009, a proposal that was opposed by the majority of her colleagues on ideological grounds. Moderate politicians like her or the senator from my own home state, Richard Lugar, left Congress, and they will be followed soon by others, I predict, the few that remain in the Senate and the House. They all seem to belong, at least to me, to an almost different planet and constitute a sort of endangered species that is in dire need of protection today. The winner of all of them, President Trump, is the antithesis of moderation, people think. It's not for me to take a stand on Trump in this talk. I just want to point out that his example, as well as the example of the supporters in the United States, the supporters of the Front National in France, or the UKIP in the United Kingdom, remind us that some will always tend to prefer to go to the extremes no matter what, especially in highly polarized contexts where dialogue tends to be replaced by monologue, distrust, and hyperbole. Oftentimes, I think it's much easier to espouse radical positions rather than moderate ones, to work with black and white contrasts and simplified Manichaean us versus them picture of reality, and advance simple slogans. But politics is much more difficult than that. It requires compromise, and we should never forget the centrality of compromise and moderation to politics. It is a necessary virtue. Moderation may have gotten a bad rep lately, as have other important things, but this doesn't mean that we cannot learn from it or we should neglect it. On the contrary, I think it may be the most necessary political virtue right now, especially in the aftermath of our contested elections and presidential debates. To claim that all of the 62 million people who voted for Donald Trump lack reason is a stupid idea. And that's what people on the left have been doing. On the right, the same remarks about the radical nature of the supporters of Hillary Clinton have been advanced. And if we keep on going down this route, we are going to live in the disunited States of America rather than the United States of America. So what can we do in order to bring us together rather than come apart? I think that we can rediscover the importance of moderation after all the noise about the campaigning for office disappears and the issue of governing, that's what we're facing now, returns into the limelight. How so? Enlightened minds from Aristotle and Cicero to Montaigne, Montesquieu and Burke and Tocqueville, indeed, knew much better. They saw something valuable in moderation than its present critics miss. They praise it as the supreme virtue of legislators. This is what Montesquieu thought of moderation, the supreme virtues of the legislator, and equated it in Aristotelian tradition with practical wisdom and reasonableness. John Adams, one of our founding fathers, went a step further, claiming that without moderation, quote, every man in power becomes a ravenous beast of prey. A cursory look at the politics of the 20th century, remembered for its two devastating world wars and horrendous concentration and labor camps in which millions of people lost their lives, shows the catastrophic effects of the lack of moderation and reminds us of the constant need for us to practice, understand this difficult and elusive virtue. The champions of moderation also understand that the latter is a complex, demanding, and difficult virtue. It constitutes a diverse tradition of thought, and it is much more than a simple trait of character, a certain trait, state of mind, or a disposition. In addition to all of this, moderation also has a distinctively political and institutional component, political and institutional dimensions and constitutional ones, and represents a certain style of political action, often manifested by the propensity to seek balance between various ideas, interests, and groups in society. And it is not, I think, a mere coincidence that the cover of my book, Faces of Moderation, represents a funambulist. This is the image of the moderate in my view. Someone, a tightrope walker, someone who walks at high altitude on a very thin rope. It takes a lot of courage to be up there. You need to train a lot. You need a certain set of skills. You also need the luck, because if the winds are too powerful, you may fall. And finally, you need a sense of direction, because you can't go forward, you can't go backward, you can't go sideways. You need to go forward, so you need to know where you are going. All this is needed, and a little bit of art, because you need to have a certain style to be up there. The question is, what moderates stand for? And that's what I would like to take up next. Because I think this is a question that most of you might be interested in a more pragmatic way. So what is the mentality of those who put moderation first? I would like to argue that in many respects, moderates are similar to this courageous tightrope walker who must always be extremely careful to retain his balance and sense of direction. Moderates, to this effect, share a steady preoccupation with political evil and seek to avoid the extremes of cruelty, suffering, anarchy, and civil war. They tend to keep the lines of dialogue open and reach out to their political opponents in order to preserve the fundamental value of their communities. They reach out precisely to their opponents, to those who disagree with them, even when disagreement is unpleasant, difficult, and frankly politically risky. Moderates do not see the world in Manichaean terms, that is to say, in terms that divide the world into the forces of the good or the light and the forces of evil or darkness. For Manichaean terms that divide the world in axis of evil and axis of goodness. And they refuse the posture of prophets. They champion sobriety in political thinking and endorse an ethics of responsibility as opposed to an ethics of absolute ends. Sometimes this involves significant personal risks and costs, and I will come back to this issue a bit later. If we are to look for a single word that characterizes many, though not all, of the political moderates that I've studied in this book, but also in general, then they might be described as trimmers. I don't know whether anyone is a sailor here. I've never sailed in my life, but I like the nautical metaphor of trimming the sails of the ship in order to keep the ship from capsizing. And that's exactly what we can learn from this metaphor. Although their adjustments may be small and unheroic at times, moderates are often enough to save the state from ruin when the balance of the ship of the state is at stake. Being a moderate demands bold vision in times of crisis, audacity and firmness, as well as a certain degree of non-conformity. Because moderates seek to restore balance, equilibrium, and equipoise in society. And to this effect, they tend to adopt some of the soundest attitude and principles of all parties, and they tend to facilitate agreements between them in order to calm passions when the passions are very high and heal wounds when the wounds are very deep. They seek to protect and foster the balance between diverse social and political forces and interests on which political pluralism, order, and freedom depend in modern society. Sometimes this requires them to deftly adapt their strategy to shifting circumstances, hence the accusation of opportunism. They reject an all-or-nothing approach, us versus them, and always keep an open mind, engaging in dialogue when facts change, accepting new evidence, again, when facts impose that, and arguments on all sides, including from their own opponents. Far from being a synonym of soft-mindedness, timidity, and hesitation, this type of moderation is a fighting, courageous, and nonconformist and dangerous virtue that refuses the litmus test of ideological purity and opposes zealotry in all of its forms. It is a strong and energetic form of moderation that must be clearly distinguished from the counterfeits of pusillanimity and indecision denounced by Edmund Burke. It thrives on partisanship and does not always search for a cozy and, in my view, most of the time illusory political consensus on dividing issues. It radiates generosity towards others and refuses to practice political vendettas. Now, in practice, moderation amounts to, but is not limited to, finding a center, sometimes finding a center between all parties, or a neutral power above all parties. This was, if you wish, the position adopted by George Washington. He distrusted factions. He wanted to find a position above factions, above parties, that would balance the ship of the state. Sometimes moderation implies building what Montesquieu called moderate government, which may take various institutional forms. While it may be tempting to equate centrism with moderation, I think that the identification between the two must not be taken as an universal rule, because we can find moderates, in my view, on the left, in the center, as well as on the right of the political spectrum, which means that moderation is not necessarily a conservative virtue. It can be, but it is always to be found in the other parts of the political spectrum. In fact, moderates, as I understand them, have worn many masks, and that's why they are so difficult to identify over time. We can look at Seneca's Stoic figure, for example, and we find traces of moderation in his blood. We can look at the prudent man as described by Aristotle, Cicero, Machiavelli, Francesco Guicciardini, and Baltasar Gracian in 17th century Spain. We can find traces of moderation in the prudence. We can look at the trimmer invoked by Marquis of Halifax, Michael Oakeshott, as well in the 20th century. We can find traces of moderation in the philosophy of skepticism, as, for example, professed by David Hume, Immanuel Kant, and Michel de Montaigne. We can find moderation in the pluralist tradition, as illustrated by James Madison and in our 20th century Isaiah Berlin. And we can also find traces of moderation in the liberal who is between the liberal in the European sense of the word, right of the center, in the middle or between the two worlds, and this is our beloved Alexis de Tocqueville. We can find traces of moderation in the critics of zealotry, fanaticism, and enthusiasm. And again, I would invoke here the names of Edmund Burke and David Hume. And we can find traces of moderation in the tradition of the committed observers, such as Raymond Aron in France and Michael Walzer in the United States, a contemporary of ours. There have been many examples of the moderate agendas, and there is one political party that invokes moderation today. I would invoke here first the tradition of eclecticism in France. In post-war Germany, the tradition of ordo liberalism, and if you wish, the party of the moderates in Sweden, a party that exists today and claims its allegiance to the principles of classical liberalism. There were also several political movements that have claimed over time to follow the principles of moderation. I would invoke here three of them. One is the Solidarity movement in communist Poland, which I encourage you to read about because it's an extraordinary example of courage and moderation and boldness at the same time. That led to the fall of communism in 1989. The Charter of 1977 in the former Czechoslovakia that was led by the former President Václav Havel, and the doctrine of the Third Way in the United Kingdom under the premiership of Tony Blair. Now, I would like to say that moderation, as defined here, is not to be seen as a virtue for everyone, nor for all seasons. Because what is moderate in one context and period may be immoderate in others. What was moderate in the early 1920s certainly was no longer moderate in the 1940s. What was moderate in the 1950s may be seen today as extremely conservative by the more radical generations today. So this brings me back to asking, what chances does moderation have today in a climate of increasing polarization and partisanship like ours at the beginning of the new century? History was supposed to have ended in 1989 after the fall of communism, but today it seems that our liberal democracies in both the United States and Europe are not in such a great shape. In fact, they are under assault of populists of all stripes and colors who have made significant inroads and gained elections in countries from Hungary and Poland to the United Kingdom and the United States. So it would be foolish to gloss over their success, the success of this movements, and dismiss it as a passing phase. We need to take that very seriously, understand the reasons of this anger and rage. But it would be equally unwise, I think, to neglect the benefits of moderation, which are many and real. Moderation is the touchstone of many contemporary political regimes, since no open society can properly function without some form of compromise and bargaining with one's political opponents. The proper functioning of our representative institutions depends to a great extent on this very virtue, which is conspicuously absent or derided in our public debates today. So there are a number of advantages of moderation that I'd like to explore with you in some detail because they might convince the more skeptical among you of the benefits that you can derive by embracing this virtue. So the greatest advantage of this virtue, in my view, is that it is not an ideology with fixed contours. It is not an ideology with fixed contours. And it is much more, in my view, than the proverbial golden mean between the extremes. As such, it can be and often is an effective means for promoting reform and change rather than defend the status quo. Why so? Because moderation allows one to think politically rather than ideologically. What does it mean? It means that one takes into account circumstances and evolving facts that constantly change. You don't have a blueprint or a set of lenses through which you see the world. The tendency to think politically manifests itself in the refusal to define one single best way. There is no such thing, one single best way. Moderates are aware that the political good is multidimensional, has many dimensions, and it is plural. That allows moderates to reach out to people on both the left and the right and be able to cooperate with them when the atmosphere is not vitiated by ideological polarization. Moderation has affinities with different political traditions, and I think that is what makes moderation extremely appealing at certain points in history. It has affinities with people on the left, in the center, as well as on the right. It can accommodate, in fact, a wide range of political ideas, views, and forms of government. And this flexibility, I think, constitutes, rather than the weakness of moderation, its greatest strength. It allows moderates to get things done when others, following a particular ideology, may fail to do so. The second advantage here is that moderation seems to be, or may be, particularly important in our post-ideological age. when all political doctrines seem to have lost their sharp contours and new forms of extremism seem to be on the rise. But we don't know whether they are extremism or other forms of anger. Moderates share the following quality that distinguish them from their opponents. They tend to feel and understand well the opposite sides of life. The idea that truth exists in various forms, this trait, I think, can be particularly helpful today, because it endows moderates with a flexible and skeptical mindset that can make us able to correct our mistakes and makes us prepared to engage in difficult but necessary trade-offs between different values and principles. In other words, I think we do have the right to hesitate, compare, and balance different consideration and arguments in each situation in accordance with the limited knowledge and information that we have at our disposals. We don't have to have a fixed idea on a particular topic, divisive as that may be, from healthcare to immigration reform. We need to keep an open mind, consider various arguments. The best that can be done as a general rule is not to strive for perfection, but to try to maintain a balance that could prevent the occurrence of stalemate. The larger goal for many moderates is to defend this pluralism of ideas, arguments, interests that is essential to any open society. There's a third advantage of moderation that I would like to emphasize here, and that has to do with the fact that moderation promotes civility. Now, speaking of virtues in great demand today, civility, along with moderation and prudence. As the union of life with measure, of spirit with reasonableness, moderation makes our minds simultaneously firm and flexible and promotes a mindset favorable to civility. It weeds out rigidity and promotes civility in social life by giving the latter, the social life, that temper and common sense that are conducive to civil politics. So in a way, moderation is a virtue that protects us against becoming self-righteous and teaches us self-restraint and humility. The following aphorism of a wise man, simply identified by Czesław Miłosz, the Polish Nobel Prize laureate, as an old Jew from Galicia, describes well what I have in mind here. This is what this old Jew wise man said. When someone is honestly 55% right, that's very good and there is no use wrangling. And if someone is 60% right, it's wonderful, it's great luck, and let him thank God. But what's to be said about 75% right? Wise people say this is suspicious. Well, what about 100% right? Whoever says he's 100% right is a fanatic, a thug, and the worst kind of a rascal. I think we need to meditate upon these words. Moderation is a virtue that protects us precisely against this fanaticism of self-righteousness. It is based on the conviction that others may be wrong, or we think they may be wrong, but nonetheless are entitled to voice and share their views, and that we stand to learn something important from their good arguments as well as from their bad arguments, from their mistakes and errors. Like the art of conversation, moderation requires a talent for speaking and listening and keeping silent, along with a good sense of irony and courtesy needed to prevent futile quarrels and violent episodes. It is the opposite of ideological intransigence. And there is a final benefit to moderation that I'd like to highlight here, which is, I think, has to do with the fact that it can help us fight various forms of fundamentalism, because moderation actually does have an appeal across borders and continents and traditions of philosophical and religious practice. Many different political traditions, cultures, and religion, from the Christian to the Muslim and the Jewish and the Confucian tradition, are able to accommodate moderation. The latter is at home not only in an Aristotelian or Thomistic framework in the Christian tradition, but also in a Jewish, Confucian, and even Islamic setting. To be sure, a fundamental idea can be found in all of these major moral and religious traditions, namely that safety and well-being lie in taking the middle course in life, by seeking to achieve, through moderation, a balance between deficiency and excess, between indulgence and parsimoniousness. The assumption is that we can taste the joys of life in abundance only if we are moderate and temperate in our desires and pursuits. And finally, I should like to point out that, at least in my understanding, moderation is a virtue tailored to human nature that aims neither too high nor too low. It doesn't ask us to become saints in our commitments, but it asks us to moderate our zeal for perfection and self-righteousness. In a way, this reminds me of what Montaigne once said. Montaigne said, our main business is to live our lives fittingly, and that is with moderation. So I'd like to end by proposing you in an immoderate vein this time, a certain set of rules for moderates. 4.5 decades ago, a man by the name Saul Alinsky, that some of you may be familiar with, some may not, a famous community activist from Chicago, published a pragmatic primer for realistic radicals. I read that book, and I found that it was a passionate counsel on how to bring about social change in a turbulent age, late 1960s, early 1970s. That's history for most of the students in this room, but for some of us, resonates still. Rules for Radicals became an instant bestseller and influenced subsequent generations of community activists around the country. Can we do the same for moderation today, changing what is to be changed? What would be the rules for realistic and pragmatic moderates? What do they look like? So I have, let's see here. I actually have 10 in a different version of the talk, but I'm going to give you only 5 so that you don't get too excited about them. I would start with rule number 1. Accept that moderation is a complex and eclectic virtue that is neither a fixed ideology nor a party platform. Moderates refuse to define one single best way, as I've said, and do not have fixed truth or dogmas. They have principles, which I can comment on in the question and answers time, but no fixed dogmas. Instead, they examine facts and are prepared to modify their beliefs when facts changed. And on the handout, the 4th quote is from David Brooks, a columnist for the New York Times, who says a few interesting things about moderation in a column published in 2012 that I think sheds light on this first rule that I mentioned. Moderates lack the assurance that allows one to settle everything, lacks that assurance. Instead, they claim the right to hesitate and weigh the pros and cons in each case. For them, consistency is not always a virtue, but they accept that moderation doesn't mean that we are rudderless in our choices. We have a compass, nonetheless. They do have moderates, they do have a moral and political compass in the defense of the principles of the open society, which include freedom, toleration, pluralism, limited power, and the rule of law. That was rule number 1. Rule number 2 sounds like this. Remember that moderation is much more than a simple trait of character, state of mind, or a disposition, much more than a simple trait of character. It has important political and institutional components that make our representative government work. The fact, for example, that we have 2 chambers in the Congress instead of 1. The fact that we have a Supreme Court that is supposed to create, let's say, a power above the fray, arguably. The fact that we have checks and balances. All of these are institutional incarnations of the principle of political moderation. Extremists think rigidly by the book and like simple solutions and simple forms of government. Moderates prefer to think politically and they like complex governments. Complexity is good, is not bad. In a way, the distinction between complex and simple government brings back memories of the debates between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, which is an interesting legacy of our political tradition. Moderates are well placed to keep the lines of dialogue open with their opponents. They can also organize at grassroots level to pursue modest, limited but precise goals. Sometimes they manage to put pressure on elected politicians and keep them accountable. And they also can serve as examples of civility in a time of ideological intransigence. The 3rd rule reads as follows. Moderates are neither perfectionist or utopian spirits. They prefer to start working with the world as is, imperfect, limited, fragmentary, not as it should be. Their world is never black and white, and they feel and understand well the opposite sides of life. That's why moderates never become, or tend to never become, dogmatic zealots, obsessed with purity, red lines, or litmus tests. Their universe, again, is not divided between the forces of the light and the forces of the darkness. They know that gray too can be beautiful. Rule number 4, moderation takes a combination of patience, discernment, skepticism, humility, and courage. It requires building capacities through education, the cultivation of dialogue, civility, self-awareness, humility, as well as speaking and listening skills. It also entails strong determination and nonconformism, intuition, foresight, judgment, flexibility, all of those virtues needed to stay on the tightrope and not fall. No belief in principle should hurt moderates, no matter how different that may be from their own. Moderates admit that most of issues, especially political issues, if not moral issues as well, have more than one side. As a result, they refuse to interpret events in light of any single value or principle, as extremists tend to do. And the final rule that I will share with you reads as follows: moderates should not avoid partisanship and must not fear polarization, contrary to the common perception that moderates seek for a cozy middle ground, a golden mean between the extremes. Great opportunities always accompany major crises. Great opportunities always accompany major crises, and moderation, as a result, should not be seen as a philosophy for tender souls, as Jean-Paul Sartre once suggested. Moderates who work across party lines can in fact benefit from tensions, conflict, and contradictions and engineer necessary compromises. And their exposure to the crossfire of radical opponents can stimulate their imagination to come up with new ideas to engineer those compromises. And if they occupy the center, as in chess, and this is the 7 quote on the handout, they can dictate the game. But that's not always the case. But in politics, as in chess, Arthur Larsen, the Assistant Secretary of Labor in the Eisenhower administration, once said, "The man who holds the center holds a position of almost unbeatable strength." As a bad chess player, I know that is true. And finally, in so doing, I think we need to acknowledge that moderates help preserve the fragile balance between diverse social forces, political interests, ideas, and groups in our societies. Their adjustments may often feel or appear as small and unheroic, and they rarely fit any party line. Yet they may sometimes be enough to save the country from ruin. And I think this is one more reason to celebrate these unsung heroes who form a party without banners that our world badly needs today. So I would like to end with this call for long live moderation. Thank you. I don't expect you to agree with what I said, and I would welcome civil disagreement and maybe forceful contestation. So let's...
Is there any room for moral, radical absolutes in moderation? I'm following and tracking with the majority of your argument, which brings me to the marginal case, but and maybe I'm misunderstanding your argument, but is there a moral and ethical absolute such as against state-sponsored genocide? Or, I guess, why would I, as a moderate, consider those?
Okay, that's a good question, thank you. I said that moderates share a preoccupation with... Yes, the question whether moderates share any political absolutes, absolute political principles, that kind of red lines, can be defined as red lines. I add a little bit to your question. I said at the beginning of the talk, I think that moderates share a preoccupation of political evil. I prefer to leave it a little bit ambiguous. Political evil defined not only as genocide, but let's say you can have communism, you can have fascism, you can have any kind of doctrines that kill people in the name of allegedly good ideals. So that's political evil. The manipulation of populations, the displacement of population, all of this, I think, can be subsumed as political evil. You mentioned the word genocide, and that's very easy. Who is for genocide? I don't know anyone who can say, yeah, I'm for genocide. So that's good. But I've noticed that when it comes to condemning political evil, people tend to be, let's say, one-sided. Most people say, well, yeah, Hitler was very bad. And moderates would say, well, Hitler was very bad, and we should never forget the atrocities committed by that, but so was Stalin and Mao, the greatest criminals of the 20th century. So that's what the moderate would add. A preoccupation of avoiding cruelty, avoiding suffering in any form. Genocide is the extreme form. So indeed, I wouldn't say it's a political absolute, but it's certainly something to avoid. It's something that they oppose. Certainly, that's on their agenda. Yes, please.
So in your metaphor of the tightrope walker, your moderate has to have a certain direction that they go. They can't go backwards and they can't go to either side. I'm just wondering, with that sort of idea of moderates, that they still have to be going in some direction, what happens when you have two people who want to go in opposite directions? So basically, when two people have base assumptions that are just entirely different. Like if we're talking about healthcare, some people just think that on principle that should not be a part of the government's job at all, whereas other people think it's like a basic human right. And that just seems like maybe you can't find a compromise if the two people run into each other.
So the question starts from the image of the tightrope walker. What happens when we have two tightrope walkers, as it were, trying to go into different directions? And the case that you bring into the discussion has to do with healthcare. I have my own answer on this. I'm going to share with you my own take on this, which is that this is a good case for thinking about moderation. The so-called Obamacare is premised on a law that has, how many pages had the written law? Thousands, 2,000 something. You can actually circle the Capitol with the pages. So my first question is, before one says one is against or for, the first question, have you read the law? And the answer is pretty straightforward. No one has read the law in this room. No one. We all have opinions. Is that good or bad? It's normal. It'd be insane to read that law. Who has read the tax code here? I'm speaking of April 15th. I always become libertarian around April 15th. I'm cured soon after that, but on April 15th you'd find a libertarian in me. But the issue here is that we need to look around, we need to learn from the experience of others. We are arguably the richest country on earth, and I think that one could say if other countries that are less rich and less fortunate than us can afford doing that, can we learn something from the way in which they are doing? Because it seems that the ratio between how much we spend and what we get is askew. So a moderate would say, these are the things that we need to talk about. Let's look at how the Germans are doing. Let's look at the Canadians. Let's look at how much we spend. Let's look at the law. Let's read the law. Let's get input rather than we are for or against, repeal or replace. Let's look at how people do it. So let's look at the pros and cons. Let's allow others the right to hesitate, and rather than say I'm for or against, let's try to keep the conversation going, because that's very important. No litmus tests here. I personally, since now I speak for myself, not as a moderate, I think that we can do better. So I think we should do better, because we spend too much and we get too little. And I think that if a country such as Norway, smaller population, can afford it, Germany can afford it too, I think we should try better. But I don't know how. I'm not sure I'm the right person to say. But I think that's in the spirit of moderation. Let's weigh the pros and cons. Let's hesitate. Let's listen more.
I feel like every good rule has an exception that helps to prove the rule. So I'm sure that you get asked this all the time, but can you tell us when would be a good time to be immoderate?
Good. Excellent. I acknowledge that one of the difficulties with this is that there's no algorithm that would tell you now it's a time to be immoderate. Actually, I think that it was okay if Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great Russian writer, the Nobel Prize winner, to stand immoderately against the Soviet system in the 1960s and 1970s and denounce the lies as lies and not seek compromise with the former system. In the book, I have a chapter dedicated to a thinker who is still alive. I have five chapters. One single author is still alive, Adam Michnik in Poland. He just turned 70. Michnik is the let's say, the most representative case of the Polish resistance to communism. Michnik was imprisoned 5 times, from 1968 to roughly 1983. The last time he was in prison, or among the last penultimate time, I'm not sure about this, he was offered a conditional offer. He was offered to be released from prison on the condition that he writes a declaration of support for the system, and he would be allowed to go to the French Riviera. Now, I don't know whether you've been to the French Riviera, but if you were to choose between a Polish prison with a typewriter and the French Riviera, where would you go? It's a rhetorical question. And I would have chosen the Riviera without any hesitation. Michnik chose the Polish prison. And he thought that compromising in that circumstance would diminish his moral stature, would be a blow to the other anti-communist activists in Poland, but it was a moral failure. And he said, no, you are the pigs. You would choose, if you were, in my case, you would go to the French Riviera, but I remain here. I'm a Polish citizen. I want to fight for liberty in my own country. So those are the moments. Now, you could say those are historical examples, 1960s, 1980s. What about today, right? And people are interested in today. Like you, I have limited knowledge about what we can do today. But one thing that worries me is precisely the fact that dialogue is no longer possible. The fact that after we announced the invitation of Charles Murray to speak at Indiana University, I've received messages from colleagues and former students who said, this was the litmus test, we can no longer be in contact anymore. I think that's what worries me. This is not a good sign. It's not a good sign in terms of civility. It's not a good sign in terms of, let's say, our ability to stay together. Because if we cut in let's say, the social bonds that unite us, what remains other than a collection of individuals bent on becoming rich quickly and ruthlessly, or ignoring each other, one or the other? Yes, please.
So I certainly agree that when you're looking at the people that are governing the country, that moderation is a desirable and achievable virtue. It seems, though, that when Tocqueville is writing, when some of the founders, right, they take a fairly pessimistic view of human nature and argue that sometimes perhaps moderation on a large scale isn't achievable. What would you say to that? Do you think that it's realistic that most people can achieve a spirit of moderation, that the majority won't have this sort of opinion based on passion rather than reason?
So I take the question to be, how can we educate people to be able to appreciate the value of moderation? Well, first and foremost, by reading the authors that have written about moderation or related virtues. I forgot to mention in my introductory remarks that I see moderation as a concept that needs to be studied in relation with other concepts. So in a way, I gave you perhaps the wrong impression that you can study moderation in abstract, separate from, let's say, prudence or compromise, or from its antonyms, such as fanaticism, extremism. You cannot. So there's a semantic field here that needs to be conquered before we exhaust this concept. But as far as education goes, I think that I would, for example, encourage my students, and I encourage all of you, to read the documents at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, because they really are a lesson into into the virtues and the limits of compromise, especially James Madison notes. I was impressed reading those for the first time thoroughly for a Liberty Fund colloquium that I attended last year, how tenuous the compromise was up until last minute. People were coming and going in Philadelphia. There was no air conditioning. People didn't like each other. They suspected each other of ill motives. So there was a lot of ill will in the room, but there were also people who had a clear vision. We can learn from that. We can learn about how they engineer those compromises and why they thought those compromises were needed. Some were good, some were not so good. The compromise about the Senate was a good. The compromise about slavery was not so good. Okay, but it was the best they could do in order to keep the country together. Again, it would have gone apart. So we can learn about all of these issues by studying the examples. But I would encourage, as a form of educating, I would encourage each of us, including myself, to ask, so who are the people we associate with? How many friends who disagree with you have? And how do you talk about divisive issues here? Okay? And then finally, I would encourage all of us to rethink what are our sources of information. What do you read in order to keep informed? What do you read? I'm just curious. How do you get yourself informed? What do you follow? Don't live in an echo chamber, in a bubble. Don't be a bubble boy or a bubble girl. Try to go out of your bubble and avoid echo chambers. So I think those would be some ways of cultivating. And be civil. I think be civil. Give a right to people to express their views politely, disagree with them forcefully. So that's my view with Charles Murray. Give him a right to and disagree with him civilly and forcefully. Reject his ideas, any ideas. Some of them are not good, but we have a room for disagreement, and we can engineer that space in such a way that we have the conversation. Yes, please.
Do you think that perhaps the founder's moderation in Philadelphia was more feasible as opposed to today when these discussions are available to the public, where a bad idea would be put on record forever and would stain a politician's name versus in Philadelphia when they were happening behind closed doors?
So the question is whether today we have less or more chances at striking a compromise and espousing moderation than in Philadelphia behind closed doors in 1787. It's true that the Constitutional Convention was behind closed doors. There were 55 individuals, all males. Okay, so no press. That's unacceptable by today's standards. We want public opinion to know more about it, and we want more inclusiveness for sure. But I do think that today, because of the ways in which we have engineered our electoral districts through gerrymandering, and because of the influence of money in politics, I think moderation has a more difficult chance than it had perhaps two centuries and a half ago. Though if you read the Constitutional Convention, it's pretty clear that things could have gone awry at any moment, and it's a miracle that they did not. So in a way, it takes some enlightened statesmen at the helm, and stateswomen, I should add today. There's no reason to exclude women anymore, of course. And I think that we were very fortunate to have a generation of exceptional political leaders that happened to be there in late 18th century. I don't think we have that generation today, so that makes the chances for moderation perhaps more difficult. But I would also give a note of optimism here. The Senate is split today. It's 52-48, so all it needs is about 4 moderates to re-engineer the balance in the Senate. I'm not saying tilting it in favor of the Democrats or any other group. I'm just saying that it doesn't take a lot of moderate voices to kind of bring the two sides more in contact with each other and convince them that they need to talk and engineer compromises. I know this may sound idealistic, and it is probably, but I do come from a state that has a tradition of political compromise, and Senator Lugar is one of them, and Senator Birch Bayh is another one. So in a way, it's odd to invoke the case of the state of Indiana here, but there are other cases that I think are, how should I put it, are worth mentioning, and we shouldn't ignore that tradition. The state of Maine, I don't know whether anyone here is from Maine. It's a great state with a tradition of independent statesmen, always independent. Susan Collins that I mentioned earlier, but also Angus King in the Senate today. So we need to look at these examples, how they engineered, how they co-sponsored bipartisan bills. I think you will find surprising conclusions there. I looked at Senator King's record, for example, because I'm interested in how a moderate might work. And for example, 40% of his bills and resolutions had both a Democratic co-sponsor and a Republican co-sponsor in 2015. 40% of the 15 bills. That's pretty good. So I think we need more politicians like that. Yes?
So Tocqueville talks some about how in the democratic age people lose the ability to understand the language of virtue. I take it from the title of your talk that you disagree slightly with that. Is that fair? Do you think we still can understand virtue, and how much success would you say you've had in pitching it that way?
So the question has to do with whether we can still hear and understand the language of virtue, you know, as opposed to self-interest. And the reference was to Tocqueville. Tocqueville had a mixed appreciation of the self-interest rightly understood, which he considered to be the greatest virtue of Americans. He thought that it's a good virtue, but it's not enough. He, as an aristocrat, would have liked great devotions, people who serve the common good out of consideration that have little to do with narrow self-interest. But that's no longer possible in modern democratic societies. And as a result, Tocqueville, I think, thought that this is like the middle ground. It's not as elevated as in the past, but it's pretty good. And if we can make it work, that's the solution for the future. I do think that moderation is a different virtue in this regard. It's a virtue that doesn't ask us to be, let's say, angels, doesn't ask us to be perfect. It only asks us to acknowledge our imperfection, limited knowledge. And that's why I think authors such as, let's say, Michael Oakeshott, who wrote about the politics of skepticism. I think authors like Oakeshott are useful for us to think about what it means to be a moderate and live a virtuous life at the same time. So the virtue of skepticism is a virtue that some of these moderates might recommend to us today. It's not necessarily a powerful virtue that would convince anyone searching for great ideas, but skepticism, I think, is a good virtue overall.
Let me just say a couple of things before we thank Arun Gripti for his wonderful lecture. There are copies of his book, his most recent book, outside on a table. His publicist has sent them. You can get them at a 40% discount. He doesn't get any of the money.
I don't get any money out of that.
I want to be very clear about that. This is what happens when you are discovered. Your publicist starts sending books around. But I've started the book. It's wonderful. I recommend it if anybody's interested. We will have a reception outside. There should be something to snack on. You can continue your questions with Dr. O'Neill and Gripti. But for now, we want to thank you for a spirited and
Thank you. Thank you.